Hello, my name's Niranjan, the host of Master of Your Crafts podcast, learning from leaders who are continuously inspired, passionate, and driven to align with their soul purpose, sharing their gifts to bring healing to others. The music is composed by Mt Everest. Today is episode number 132, and I had the pleasure of talking to Andy Smith, a heavy drinker all his life, but everything fell apart at the age of 50 as a father of three. Redemption came from a very strange place. A Michael Jackson song started a journey of self-discovery that led him to get on his bike for charity, riding up Mount Everest, the course of Tour de France, and across the Arctic Circle. Andy now helps others and speaks regularly on what his sobriety journey has taught him. And now it prepared him to push beyond his own self-imposed limitations. Enjoy this conversation, and I trust you will gain some garnered wisdom from Andy during this conversation. So enjoy, and thank you for watching and listening. Hello and welcome to Andy. How are you, Andy?
I'm absolutely fantastic today. Thank you very much. It's lovely to speak to you again. And yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I think, reflecting on the work you do and the work I do, I think there's some real interesting commonalities and synergies. So I hope people are going to enjoy this, maybe hearing some of the similar principles that you talk about, perhaps
Yeah,
with a slightly different application.
absolutely.
But yeah, no, delighted to be here and thank you for having me on.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, and thank you for that. And I'm sure and trusting that this conversation is going to bring an interesting concept, an interesting navigation of experiences and journey, and all of those delicious pieces that we all bring to the table. So, thank you for taking the time ahead of time
My
for
pleasure.
for this conversation. So, I'm going to start with a really big bold question because this is what
Go
I do. What is it you believe about yourself? And does it define you based on all that you have been through in your years of alcoholism and panic attacks and how people navigate life through the journey of pain and suffering and considered it as normal, but really, in essence, it isn't. So, how have you navigated that part of your life? And we'll get into some of the other pieces of how. Do you feel it defines who you are now on the outset of coming through all of that? And does it define who you are?
You weren't joking, were you? That's a big question.
No.
um, I think it's a great question, and I think as you're talking there, I'm kind of thinking,
Mhm.
how do I view myself? How have I come to an awareness of how do I view myself? Because I think that is kind of evolved and enhanced over the years, and I think there's probably, I think I've probably when you talk about pain and suffering, I think I've always felt like I've never really been quite good enough.
Mhm.
And I think I've carried that with me a lot. And it is, whilst it has created me a lot of pain, I think and I, sought refuge from that within alcohol. Um I think also it's been a huge driver of a lot of what I was good at as well, because I think when you feel like that about yourself, it makes you quite restless. It makes you cert I've never been one to sit back on my laurels. I always feel that I need to be better at
Yeah.
everything. So, I think in my 58 years going around the sun, I think I've learned to embrace both sides of that. And I think the probably the last 7 or 8 since I managed to kind of, I suppose, let's say, deal with that in a more constructive way rather than just slinging ethanol down my throat all the time to try
Mhm.
and mask it. Um, I think, I've kind of I've learned to see it as kind of, a bit of a double-edged sword. I don't know if that's even the right way to do it. It
Mhm.
has certainly fueled a lot of my success. My background in the corporate world, I did some huge things that previously had not been thought were possible.
Right.
And certainly, I guess gained quite a reputation for being an innovative thinker, very driven. And yet on the other side of it, on an internal side of it, um, that never really solved that pain
Right.
of I'm not good enough. Today I'm going to get found out.
Right.
Um, Imposter syndrome. Um, and it was interesting. I mean, thank you for your kind summary of my kind of journey, but it was kind of interesting if I reflect back over the last few years and kind of getting sober, and then what that has led me on to do. Um, for example, when I rode the Tour de France course,
Mhm.
it was interesting managing that overwhelm of I am doing something that physically is so far beyond what I have even got close to before. And I remember quite early on into the ride, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Tour de France, it's
Mhm.
21 stages, 3,500 kilometers
Right.
over the Alps, over the Pyrenees, basically right around France. And I remember probably day 3 or day 4, um, getting a real crisis of confidence. And the reason being, and this is bizarre, but it's true. There were a bunch of guys, I'm quite a big lad. I don't look like your typical cyclist. And there were people there that were fatter than I was. And I took enormous comfort from that.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, there's somebody who clearly has not put the training in the way I have, or whatever. And I remember on day 4 waking up and I thought, where are the big guys?
Mhm.
And I'd not realized that they were only there to ride the first 3 days and they'd gone home.
Mhm.
So now I was the big guy at the back.
Right.
And I found that quite devastating in a way. I just thought, what have you signed up for here, sunshine? Everybody
Mhm.
else looks like a athlete compared to me. Make no mistake, I'd lost a lot of weight, I'd put the training in and all
Sure.
this kind of stuff. And it was interesting. I started that day um, thinking I may not make this. This
Mhm.
might be beyond me. I may have bitten off more than I can chew. And then, funnily enough, at the end of that day, we had a double descent of a hill in Brittany that's called the Mur de Bretagne, the Wall of Brittany.
Okay.
And I did one descent, and that was fine. Um, and then the hotel was at the bottom of the hill, so we had to turn around and go down one last time. And it was a beautiful road. They'd resurfaced the road for the professional race coming through the week later. And I thought, oh, I'm just gonna have some fun here. It'd been an exhausting day, and I thought I'm just gonna zip back to the hotel as quickly as I can. So I shot down this hill, and when I looked at my app Strava, where you kind of log your calls, I discovered that my descent was the 14th fastest of all time down that hill. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. This Isaac Newton was not messing around when he said about this gravity thing and large objects and things like that. And I got back to the hotel and I showed a couple of friends. I was like, oh, look at this. Would you believe it? And one of them snatched the phone off me. And he was like, holy whatever,
Mhm.
this is
Mhm.
huge. And word got round and there was a bit of a buzz at dinner. And that night at dinner, I got the award. We did an award every night where you were given a yellow arrow.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, that one up there.
and one of the yellow arrows that they used to signpost the route. And I got a standing ovation at dinner um, because of what I'd done going downhill. And I had all these people that I had, put on this pedestal of, these athletes. These were club cyclists and people who'd cycled all their lives.
Wow.
And then they're coming up to me and asking me what my technique was. And I'm thinking, well, my technique was probably eat more pies than you. And I just thought, isn't that interesting
Yeah.
that you can go in the space of one day from a position of abject hopelessness and
Mm,
what am I doing here? Feeling completely unworthy, feeling stupid that I even considered that I could have achieved such a thing, to getting a standing ovation at dinner.
mm, mm,
And make no mistake, the whole thing was a real struggle all the way through.
mm,
Up
mm.
what goes downhill very fast goes uphill rather slowly. Um, but that was such a lesson for me,
Yeah.
in that don't count yourself out
Yeah.
on anything, because there are often opportunities that come along. So that's a very long way of answering your question, but I think that has probably been my greatest lesson over the last few years, is that there are things that, yeah, you probably don't feel very good about yourself, and I'm sure anybody listening to this will have the things that they hate about themselves, but there are also flip sides to that coin. And it took me a long time to learn this.
Mhm.
But it's true. And when you do finally get it, it's quite a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. So the definition of that, just one experience, because I imagine there would have been many of experiences that have all come together to converge into, okay, now I'm going to do this. And now this is what I feel about who I am, which leads me into supporting others on their journey and their convictions and all of that space. What do you feel are some of the attributes that connect you to that, be it that one experience or the others that have aligned themselves?
I think, again, as you get older, you look back and you see
Mm,
threads that kind of move through your life in a fairly consistent way. And I think I've always been somebody who, and again, perhaps some of this is fueled by, a personal sense of not being good enough, but I have always wanted to ease others' pain.
mm,
I've always wanted to help others. If I look back, even through my childhood, um, the that kind of desire to be of service, to turn my own suffering into something meaningful for other people, even just little things as when I was younger. Um, I think that's definitely a thread that's kind of gone on through this. And I think that was what, relatively quickly after I sort of found my own answers on my own addiction journey,
mm,
I was professionally very curious about it, because I had tried all the traditional things. I'd been to AA meetings, I'd tried hypnotherapy, I'd been to counseling and
right.
all of these kind of things, and none of it had worked. So I just assumed that I was in some way unfixable.
Mm,
Um, and then when I had my little epiphany, and that set me off on a different tangent to kind of find my own answers,
yeah.
that very quickly moved to a really very strong desire to, first of all, understand it for
Mhm,
myself. It's like,
mm,
okay, is this just something that is unique to me, or is it something that can help others? So I was intellectually quite curious. I mean, my
yeah.
background was in sort of selling and influencing, and I'm like,
Right.
wow, this is quite a shift I've just experienced here.
Yeah.
And is this something I can learn? My degree's in physics. I'm a big fan
Mm,
of kind of understanding the why things happen, as well as
right.
just observing them. And I found some people online and said, look, I've recorded some videos. Can you just try this stuff out for you? And everybody was
Right.
like, oh my God, this is quite profound what you're doing. I thought, okay, maybe I need to not just put this away in a drawer and just leave it there. I think it's got value to the wider world. And I've been in some ways surprised, but also not surprised by my passion and desire to bring this to a wider audience. And so things like riding the Tour de France, things like riding my bike up Mount Everest or across the Arctic Circle or things like that, raising money for charity, trying to raise some awareness around this kind of stuff. All of that stuff just kind of links in, I think, to that.
Mhm.
I don't know whether higher purpose is the right way to put it. Maybe it is, but it's just a very deep rooted kind of passion to help others
Yeah.
and to find a way that to do that sustainably, that I can help as many people as I can. I mean,
Yeah.
to do this full time requires you to charge for your services and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, but if I was just doing this as a little thing, an
On
evening
the
a week,
side.
I
Yeah.
certainly wouldn't have been able to help the amount of people that I have. And but I think anybody who's listening to this that is kind of perhaps thinking about, well, who am I? What have I been put on this planet for, and things like that. It's kind of I think, I don't know if it's a process you can necessarily rush. I think, certain things have to happen that make you ask different questions, and then you start to get different answers. I love the movie Slumdog Millionaire, where the he sat there in the chair getting asked the questions, and the reason why he knows the answers is because of the pain that he went through in all these different experiences to actually learn it. And I think
Yeah.
I kind of feel a little bit like that, in terms of sometimes your pain has meaning, but unfortunately it takes time to get that perspective, to kind of see that actually there was value in that, even though it felt
Mhm.
horrendous at the time.
Mhm.
Um, it actually led to bigger and better things. But maybe I had to wait a decade for that to actually come to fruition.
Right. Right. But even on that journey, it's quite admirable to be in that space and recognize your own vulnerability of what you would have had to go through, of that moment in Tesco's that you had referenced in our previous conversation, that big moment
Yeah,
that ultimately life changing for you, to really look at yourself as you have that panic attack in a very public place and
yeah,
have, if I can summarize what felt like, or what I received as a life review.
yeah,
What's going to happen? Where am I at? What's going on in my life? So the vulnerability, the courage, and the strength in order for you to look at all of what you've witnessed and experienced, to me, are really key attributes to do that self-reflection. And we're often in a society where those things can get dismissed real fast
yeah,
because we just chalk them down to a thing of, oh, yeah, it's okay, I can do that and I can be in that space, but I've still got to live life and I've still got to fit in and be normal based on our societal pieces. So let's just go to the pub and have another drink. It it's that fitting in space and the courage to stand out from that and make that shift, I think, is often overridden so easily in our society because we don't want to be different. Some people don't want to be different.
yeah.
They don't want to stand out from the crowd.
And I think, listening to you sort of phrasing that, I think it is interesting that all you get in those moments are questions.
Mhm.
And for me, half lying in a fridge in a supermarket in Wokingham in the UK,
Mhm.
getting helped up by a 70-year-old lady asking me if I was all right. All that comes then are questions. How on earth have I let it come to this? What what is wrong with you? How can you be such an idiot? How can you have let things slide this far? All of these things are questions, and all of which are deeply uncomfortable questions.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. And 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 I think if I go through my kind of like reflection of the sort of the weeks surrounding that, that was not my epiphany moment per se. That was, if people want to talk about a rock bottom, that was probably it, where you just,
Right.
you survey the devastation of your life. I mean, I was on antidepressants, and
Right.
alcohol is an addictive depressant. So I
Mhm.
would sit and drink a bottle of gin of an evening and then wake up in the morning and take a tablet that is an antidepressant. And
Mhm.
you're like, that sounds, in the cold light of day, it sounds crazy. But it was the situation I'd got myself into. So depression, antidepressant, depression, antidepressant. And I did a reasonable job of sweeping some of it under the carpet, but kept the important questions. And those questions tend not to go away. And that led to a kind of a further sequence of events of just, I suppose you could argue, putting those questions back on the table. And, I talk a lot about the kind of the thing that was my epiphany moment, which happened probably a few weeks later, um, rushing for a meeting, running late in my car, anxiety through the roof. I stopped at ironically, about half a mile from where the Tesco supermarket is, stopped at a zebra crossing because at a level crossing because the barriers were coming down, contemplated flooring the accelerator to try
Mhm.
and beat the things, and then just, pulling up short and going, what are you doing? Again, questions.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is madness.
Mhm.
You're putting your life at risk for
Right.
a business meeting. And then that song came on the radio while I was in, let's call it, hyper reflective mode. And the Michael Jackson song, The Man in the Mirror. And I'm starting with the man in the mirror and I'm asking him to change his ways. And the beauty of being in a car, again, the universe has this wonderful way of just putting you in a situation where you can, be more receptive, coincidences show up. And there I am sitting in my car, staring at my eyes in the rearview mirror. And my entire life changed on one word in that song, which was asking to move from beating myself up, from being so self-critical and so judgmental about myself. Again, not good enough, all of that stuff. That um, narrative was running riot. And I remember just staring at those eyes in the mirror and almost pleading with this guy that was in the reflection and saying, are you up for this?
Mhm.
Can we make a change here? And almost like the voice came back from somebody else. And, in some ways it was that part of me that was getting swept under the carpet. I just said, are you up for this? And the answer came back, yes. And it was the first time in my life that I'd said yes and meant it. And that set me off on, and it's an extraordinary feeling when that happens. You suddenly feel empowered, you feel hopeful, you
Mhm.
have a sense of strength, a sense of purpose that is extraordinary. And it comes from source. It is very authentic, I guess is the way I can
Mhm.
describe it. And funnily enough, that morning I turned my car around and I went home. I didn't carry on
Mm.
to the business meeting. I phoned my boss, who I hated with a vengeance, um, and said, "Look, I'm not well. I'm not coming." He was his usual supportive, not self, and that led me to 3 days of all of the questions. But I think when you're in that kind of place of kind of optimism about the fact that the answers may bring help, it's easier to not sweep those questions under the carpet. And again, using the metaphor of a car, I was literally sitting down by a little lake, which is near where I live, and I got all of the paperwork from every single selling course, mindfulness work, coaching calls, everything.
Mhm.
It was all in the car. And it was just interesting. I thought, right, the answers are in here somewhere.
Mm.
I've just got to find them. I've got to make sense of them. And I've got to try and put this together into a bit of a plan that's going to get me to where I want to get to.
Right.
And there was something extraordinarily empowering about that because it was kind of finite. It's like I don't have to look outside the car. And it
Special.
took me 3 full days, dawn till dusk, each day,
Yes.
just sitting, mapping stuff out, reading, revisiting things, and just it was just like little clicks in a combination lock. One, two, and I often say this with clients. If you want change, you're in the process of unlocking yourself. And if there's 20 numbers in that combination lock, you need all 20 and you need them in the right order. And you might already have 18 of them and you're hunting for the last two, or you might have three, or you
Yeah.
might have all 20 and they're just all jumbled up in the wrong order.
Right.
Um, and, it all starts with that ability, I think, to kind of question yourself in a way that doesn't feel destructive, that feels like it's actually going to help you and it's going somewhere.
Hmm. So from that, which is commendable that you can articulate such a story that is so emotionally telling. It's a journey.
Yeah.
And with it being so charged, possibly at that moment of time, being in a position to now be humble with yourself, and hopefully you was kind to yourself during that period rather than I should have done that and I should have done this and da, 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 all of that, because it's a natural process that we go through. In reflection of those 3 days and you sifting out all of those milestones to build that combination of that lock, to the analogy that you're using, what do you feel is your calling and purpose at this moment of your life?
I think what started off as quite a personal and kind of, I don't know if selfish is the right word, but it was certainly very self-centered journey in terms of sorting myself out. It's now, I would say, to try and bring a new narrative to this whole field. I had a great quote from Sylvester Stallone, and he said, I wanted to leave a smoking crater in the whole genre of action movies in the
Mm,
1980s. And that's, I guess, kind of how I feel a little bit. I want to kind of shake it up a bit.
mhm.
And I want to, I want it to be okay to look at new ways of doing this because there are certain things that we know in the business world, for example, if you
Yeah,
want to if you want to solve a problem and move towards a different solution,
right.
you have to first of all understand what the solution is. And I think a lot of the narrative, certainly what I've experienced in the field of addiction, is it's quite guilt based, quite shame based,
Right.
and very much around, well, you've got this massive problem and there's because there's something wrong with you and
Yeah.
all of this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying that you don't need to accept the problem, but I think for me, the thing that made the biggest difference was just that my ego got kind of forced to one side and I became almost like a child again, where everything was new, everything was up for grabs, and I realized that there was a whole load of stuff that clearly I had not learned for whatever reason on this kind of life journey. And I set about getting busy to learn it. And now it's around bringing that to other people. And it's funny, when I was in the kind of the corporate world, my most satisfying moments were always when I helped somebody develop their career. So
Sure.
if I had a sales rep that became, a sales manager or something like that, they were my wins. They were my kind of
Mhm.
proudest moments. And there's a lady just in my Facebook group this morning there just put a post up saying, "Thank you, Andy, for what you've done. 3 years with no drink. Can't believe
Mm.
what a difference it's made to my life." And that's kind of all I need, to be honest, is
Mm.
just, I'm kind of like, good, there's somebody who's feeling better about themselves today. And, I've saved marriages, I've saved
Mm.
lives and all of this kind of
Mm.
stuff. And it just, there's a kind of a general feel good that comes with that. And you just, in the tough days, the tough moments, um, it's enormously comforting to know that what you do has value to others. And I just feel a massive sense of purpose around reaching more people. Because there is no one size fits all. We're all human beings, we're all unique, we all have our little foibles. But I've seen enough to know that this has merit and this can really help people, particularly when they've tried all the other stuff. And because it hasn't worked, they've taken all the blame onto themselves.
Mm.
And I'm still shocked. I mean, just to kind of talk specifically about addiction, I'm still shocked at how people can be so hard on themselves and yet completely let alcohol off the hook. So they will look at a glass of Chardonnay or whatever with goo goo eyes and real romance, and yet, say all sorts of terrible things to themselves when they wake up with a hangover and things like that.
Right.
And some of the work I do is about transferring that. Let's
Yeah.
find a way to actually, rather than telling yourself you're the bad guy, can we focus on who the bad guy really is here?
That's
There's an
right.
addictive substance here that is, hooked you in.
Yeah.
Um, and just, I think it's just bringing that fresh thinking to a very old problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I find it interesting how we go through life and we go through careers and different roles and different scenarios, because you've definitely had your fair share of different environments and roles that you have played in the corporate space or in the professional working paid for money exchange scenario.
Yeah.
And I find that from myself, and perhaps, which is the question, in your journey of being in these roles, be it in the sales space or be it in the customer service driven areas, there is ultimately a sense of purpose there, even though it's for stakeholders and shareholders, bottom line, and all of that revenue based. How do we sift through that version of what is good for the bottom line in a corporate perspective and still gain some true, authentic fulfillment from that versus having your own experience and your own journey and offering that again, fee for service. We've been through experiences, we've learned, we've grown to be able to offer that from others. But I believe we can truly authentically do that once we have been through it. We can't lead others through a path that we fully haven't got through out the gate. But that's a different side conversation, I guess. So
Yeah.
how do you surmise or even come to terms with being in that corporate space of here's my purpose and here's my offering and it's viable versus now I'm a consultant, entrepreneur, startup, however you want to position yourself, that you're all of it and make it okay in shifting the narrative, especially out there, of this is a viable service offering?
I think it's really interesting. And if I reflect back on my own experience, I had a lot of success. I won a lot of awards
Mhm.
in the corporate world. And, generally, I think when I look at the different companies that I was part of, I was probably always one of the bigger personalities that would sort of be in there. So I think that kind of desire to make a difference, I was never somebody who was a bit of a shrinking violet to kind of just keep your head down and whatever. I think there is real nobility in giving your best at a job to provide for your family.
Mhm.
And and if that's what you see as your purpose, and uh, you know, brilliant. That was my purpose for many years. Um, I mean, I look now and I think I'm probably unemployable, because I think if you put me back in a corporate environment, I've just kind of I'm
Right.
now incompatible with that. I would be questioning everything, and that's not what people want in that kind of thing. And actually, in that role I was in, I was running a veterinary company, um, and part of it was, I think, at the kind of the end of my evolution out of that,
And
because I was very much taking a fresh pair of eyes to things, and I mistakenly thought that's what they wanted because that's what I was told in interview. But actually, it was way too uncomfortable for
mm,
some of the stakeholders. And, it was kind of like get back in your box, even though I was
yeah,
turning the business around.
yeah.
Um, they were uncomfortable with the speed of change. Um, and so I think, we talk a lot about being on that kind of life's journey. And, I remember going from school to university, and I did physics at university. Why did I do physics at university? Because I was good at it at school.
Right.
No other reason than that. And I quite enjoyed it. It fitted my kind of curiosity narrative. I went from there to move into HR with Marks and Spencer, big retailer in the UK. Um, which again was deemed to be like the golden job back in
Mhm.
1989. Good grief. Showing my age there. Um, and, that was one of the absolute fantastic jobs. But at the end of the day, you were a manager of a large shop. And
Yeah.
quite quickly, I realized this is not me.
Right.
And I did it for a few years. Again, I was quite good at it, but it didn't feel great. And then I got a job in the pharmaceutical industry and sales, and I loved it. I loved being able to get in my car and go and meet new people every day and make an impact on them,
Yeah.
and quite quickly become one of the more popular sales reps in the local area, and to be able to get invited in behind the receptionist desk and go and get the kettle
Mhm.
on and make everybody a cup of
Mhm.
coffee and stuff. That again was kind of, that ticked a lot of boxes for me. Um, and yeah, and then there was that kind of relentless drive to get more senior roles, more senior roles, more senior roles.
Mhm.
One point I was running, a big sales team with 10 managers, 150 sales reps. Um, but you do kind of get to this point where you're like, and how did I get here? Why did I want this again? Again, I enjoyed it, had a great time, drank myself senseless through all of it. But was really good at it, and still friends with a lot of those people today. So yeah, I think some people are kind of cut out for entrepreneurship and some people
Yeah.
really aren't. I
Yeah.
think, it's being an entrepreneur sounds wonderful. It's deeply uncomfortable at times, and there are times when you really question why you're doing it, and you've got to have a really good answer to that question. when you're lying awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, wondering how bills are going to get paid and things like that. That is not a comfortable place for an awful lot of people. And, you can get a job and you can go and text your mates in the toilet and still get paid. And it doesn't work like that with entrepreneurship. So, I'm certainly not here saying it's kind of everybody should do it, but I probably would say everybody should try it. Because
Yeah.
if you've got something that's in your heart that you feel has got value to the world, then, in the same way that I felt about what I discovered for myself and then subsequently for other people, is I cannot leave this in a drawer. I cannot just go, oh, well, that's nice. I've got my own answers and I've helped 10 other people. It was just that was never an option for me.
Mm. Mm. It's so interesting that those decisions and those options, because it's still ultimately a choice. You chose not to leave it in the drawer. You still have a choice. That then becomes a driver to perhaps influencing other parts of your life, not only your professional life, because I would imagine it's transformed your personal relationships.
Yeah.
So I find it interesting when people choose to take bigger action based on some of the turmoil and some of the what's positioned as difficult experiences, which you and I know just opportunities to embrace who you truly are.
Sure.
Put in a place of, I get to make this decision. Do I want to step out of the box or do I want to stay in it? And what does that look like? How can I get to a space of a bigger fulfillment? Was all of that just a training ground to get to where you are?
And I think that's a pretty astute observation. I think it often is a training ground. I think if there's one thing I've learned, it's that choices are made emotionally rather than rationally, certainly emotionally first. I think for me, the very nature of addiction is because to drink or not to drink, if you want to look at it simplistically, you
Yeah,
can choose to drink or you can choose
absolutely.
not to.
Absolutely.
But if you're addicted to something, you don't want to choose it, and yet you feel unable to not choose it. And
Right.
that's horrible. I mean, anybody who's, and I think let's be clear, addiction exists in everybody to various different
Absolutely.
things. It's like,
Absolutely.
okay, if you think you're not addicted to anything, just put your smartphone away for 2 weeks.
Yes.
You'll soon learn, what addiction looks like. And,
That's right.
and it's a natural reward process that gets hijacked by other things.
Yeah.
But, I think the whole concept of choice, our life is all, where we're at now in our lives is a function of the choices we've made over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to bet they were all emotional in nature, all the big ones anyway. The house you live in, the partner you have, the career, all of these things, the big stuff tends to get made at an emotional level. And it's very difficult for the rational mind, for the conscious mind to even compete against that. So even though, as I use in my example, I didn't want to leave what I discovered in the drawer,
Yeah.
there were lots of reasons to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I made a lot of money in the corporate world. I certainly make a lot less now. There are lots of reasons to kind of go, well, just stick with doing what you're doing. But
Mm-hmm.
when that itch starts, it doesn't go away. And actually, when you do scratch it, or it's a terrible metaphor,
It is.
but when you start to kind of follow your own North
Right.
Star a little
Yeah.
bit more,
Mm-hmm.
it feels amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the amazing work that you do,
Mm-hmm.
um, again, all sorts of rational reasons not to do such a thing.
Absolutely.
Um, but it's something you're passionate about. It's
Yeah.
something that you love. It's something, that resonates with purpose. And I think if you find that, and you pursue it, I think it's an extremely privileged place to get to. And
Yeah.
it requires, and you've used that word, and for me it's about courage. You know, if you
Mm.
can find your own courage on things, and you know, this is not about glory, it's not about, you know, showboating, it's just about keeping going
Yeah.
when all seems unclear.
Yeah.
You know, finding that way. And sometimes that means just getting really small about things. It's funny, before the tour, we went on a training camp and there was a guy who'd ridden it the previous year. I was riding along with him, and I was just asking him for, you know, little tips, you know, what do you wish you'd known, you know, before you
Mm.
went? And it was things like, you know, just real practical stuff like, as soon as you get into the hotel, wash your kit, because you think you will, you know, you'll feel better about doing it later, and you won't. You know, so just, you know, you're off the bike, just wash your kit, get in the shower, wash your shorts, wash all this
Yeah.
kind of stuff, get it all hung up and out to dry, then you can enjoy the rest of your evening.
Right.
Because if you put it off, you will
Yeah.
never do it. But he also said a really interesting thing. He says the thing is, there will be days where you'll wake up and you will just go, I can't do this. And he said you will want to cry all day,
Mm.
and I totally get that. I Stage 14 was that day for me, and it was desperate, and it was ironic because we were going through the Ardèche, which is a very beautiful part of France, and
Mm.
I was really angry with myself because I'm cycling along in this beautiful, and looking at the, you know, the beautiful views, and hating it. And I was like, but there was a guy that got up every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning and put yellow arrows on the lamppost. So whenever you got to a roundabout, whenever you got to a junction, the arrow said, go straight, go left, go right.
Yeah.
And you didn't question it, because he trusted him. And so on those days, it was right. Get on your bike, turn the pedals, follow the yellow arrows. Think about
Mm.
nothing else.
Mm.
Because if you follow the yellow arrows, you'll get fed every 40 kilometers or so.
Mm.
And if you do it for long enough, then you will have a bed for the night. And that's all. Every time if you start visualizing the Champs-Elysees and riding
Right.
around the Arc de Triomphe, it's like, no, that's just too far away. That's still 7 stages away, and I've still got
Mm.
the Pyrenees in front of me. That feels too overwhelming. So today,
Right.
just for today, get on your bike, turn the pedals, follow the yellow arrows. I worked out after I came back in those 3 weeks. I turned the pedals on the bike just under 1 million times.
Oh my goodness.
And some of those turns of the pedals were amazing.
Yeah.
Some of them were terrible, but they were all necessary and they all had to be endured. And
Mm.
um, I learned so much about myself in those 3 weeks. I mean, um, yeah. Uh, but just that importance, you know, and that for me, that's what courage looks like.
Mm.
When all seems lost, can you just keep going? You know,
Yeah.
as the old when the path ahead is uncertain, walk slowly. Um,
Yeah.
you know, one of the best
Yeah.
bits of advice I was ever given.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I love that. And in context, there's less distractions.
Yeah,
You're there to just do one job, get on the bike, pedal, and just
yeah,
follow it through. Whereas in our lives, we've got a gazillion things happening.
yeah,
Family, friends, colleagues, clients, all of it.
yeah,
And that in itself can be overwhelming and take us off that path of following that yellow arrow, to your analogy. It
yeah,
happens real quick. And then we lose esteem, and then we can be in a place of, am I worthy to actually be there and do this? Because coming full circle, that's where it all really started. Is am I worthy enough to receive the award, to do the work that I do, to support others on their journey of turmoil, I guess.
And an imposter syndrome is a very real thing.
Absolutely.
I think, uh, you know, who am I to do this? It's like that wonderful Shine quote by Marianne Williamson that Nelson
Mm-hmm.
Mandela used.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, who am I to be glorious, beautiful, or whatever I don't remember the exact
Yeah.
words, but then the follow-up question is, who are you not to be?
Yeah.
Um, and, and that is a more interesting question. It's like, it's very easy to talk yourself down and think, well, everybody else has got this figured out and it's just me. And that's just not true. And everybody has value for other people. Maybe you're the person that, just gives somebody a smile on the way to work today. And that's everything they needed to not make a very poor decision because they're
Exactly.
struggling with their mental health. Um, even my little lad, my youngest, he's 10 now, but he was one of the smiliest babies. And I remember walking down the street with him in my arms and being struck by the fact that everybody walking towards me had a massive smile on their face. And I was like, what is going on here? I was thinking, has
Mm-hmm.
my zip come down in my trousers or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
And I turned and look, and Josh was just beaming at everybody.
Yeah.
And it was just interesting. I just thought, you've just lit everybody else's day up here, young
Yeah.
man, just
Yeah.
by, he was just making eye contact with them. He's like one.
Right.
But it's hard not to smile at a happy baby. They just
Right. Exactly.
and I looked at him and I just said, "Thank you, son. You've made my world a world of smiles today."
Mm-hmm.
And and I've told him that story subsequently, probably quite a few times, and it's interesting. I see that same smile come back on his face when I tell
Mm.
him,
Beautiful.
uh,
Beautiful.
and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, so everybody has value. And sometimes maybe what we're talking about here is finding out what that is an interesting quest.
Yeah. And it's a journey in itself, right? You've had your journey, I've had
Yeah,
mine, and lots of people have had their journey to get to that place of recognizing what is it that lights them up that can
yeah.
support others. Because when we believe it about ourselves, then it becomes more tangible and more real that we can offer that to others.
And I would argue it probably mostly comes from pain and risk.
Mm-hmm.
Learning that, because
Mm-hmm.
it's rarely comfortable.
That's
Um,
right.
some lessons are great. I often say to people on the sobriety journey, sometimes, it's climbing a Munro in Scotland, one of the big hills, and
Mm-hmm.
watching the sun come up and thinking, wow, life is beautiful. Or maybe it's waking up face down on the lounge floor at 3 o'clock in the morning, thinking,
Right.
I don't want to do this anymore.
Right.
Lessons come in many forms. And
They
I
do.
think, again, one of my lessons has been that if you don't listen to the lessons, then they just get bigger.
They do. Absolutely. They get real loud. They get real loud. And that's the opportunity we get, right? Is to share ours so it doesn't hit other individuals. To the
Yeah.
analogy that I often use is with a big 2x4.
Yeah.
Because it can be a little small little pebble in our shoe. As we
Yeah.
walk, it grinds against the bottom of our toe. And as life continues, that pebble then becomes a little bit larger and we trip and we fall and we get up and we dust ourselves off and we continue to the analogy of it becomes a 2x4 and we're debilitated, be it
Yeah.
on the floor or be it with an injury or be it with whatever it is where it hits you physically in a bigger way. And that's when we get the opportunity to say, I really got to look at this because there's more to it than the narrative that's been projected towards us out of life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Andy, I feel like I can talk to you for at least another hour. What a delightful conversation.
I've really enjoyed this. It's been
Yeah,
lovely.
I have too. So as we wind down into this delightful conversation, what's next for you?
I think there's an element of just pursuing my vision. It's funny, last year, from a physical challenge standpoint, and I'm 58 now, so at some point, I will probably need to make different choices. But for now, I'm still 16 in my head, and
Yes.
so I do that. So I'll put this out there to the universe because it's
Good.
not a given. Um,
Um,
and let's see what comes back. But so I rode my bike to Everest Base Camp last October,
wow.
and when I came back from that, I thought, "Ooh, I'm not." I felt quite low because I thought, well, okay, I've ridden up Mount Everest. There are no bigger mountains. I've ridden the Tour de France. That's the biggest bike race in the world. I can't run. My knees will not have me
Mhm.
doing that. So the bike is great. And I just thought I'd maybe that's it then. Maybe from a physical challenge, maybe I've done all that kind of technically I'm capable of on this kind of route. And then, funnily enough, I saw a documentary on Amazon about the Iditarod Trail, which started off as a husky sled race across Alaska, but now you can do it on foot and you can do it on a bike. And I watched this documentary, and they have an invitational race, so you have to qualify. So I've got a couple of qualifying races this winter, but it's in snow. It's in the middle of winter across Alaska with everything that's going to throw to you. So that will be January 2026. I'm going to do the first three stages of the Tour de France next year just because I miss my mates. There's a lot of them go back every year, and I last saw them in 2022. So I'm going to do that, and and it just again gives me a kind of a vehicle to just keep flying the flag for, what, if you don't drink alcohol, your life doesn't get worse, it
Yeah.
gets better. And you
Yeah.
start asking yourself different questions
Yeah.
because when you overcome that, you kind of go, well, what else am I capable of? Where else does my greatness lie?
Mm.
And everything we've been talking about in here. So that the Iditarod Trail Invitational, January
Wow.
2026. You heard it here first.
Wow.
But I need to get invited. So
Yeah.
um, I've got to do the qualification stuff. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting project.
Wow. That's very courageous. I commend you for all of that. And I'm excited to see how it unfolds for you. So maybe, I don't know, the spring of 2026, we'll
Yeah,
get on another call and give
we
me
can
your wisdom that you have garnered
we
from
can
that.
count how many fingers I've got left from
Yeah.
frostbite and things like that.
Yeah. Having lived in Canada for over 20 years, I commend you
Yeah,
for
you know all
offering
about.
to be in there for
Oh,
for
sure.
that juncture. Yes. Wow. That's going to be quite right. So interesting.
Sure.
But nevertheless, thank you so much for sharing your story, your vulnerabilities, and your courage for not only
You.
for yourself, but also to support others on their journey. So thank you, Andy, so much for sharing.
No, thank you for having me on. It's a real privilege.
I'm Naranjan, and you've been listening to Master of Your Crafts podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review, and join me next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.